Part 39. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 382. Hirui felt unwell and excused himself to go to the latrine. Chen Zhou stepped forward and said, "Sir, let me do it." Tang Ning looked at Lu Teng and asked, "Is that okay?" "Don't worry, Mr. Tang." Chen Zhou patted his chest and said, "I believe in Commander Lu's archery skills." Along the way, Tang Ning had seen Lu Teng demonstrate his archery skills several times, and knew that his archery skills were extraordinary. But hitting an apple on a person's head 30 steps away would test not only his archery skills, but also his psychology. If his hands were with a shake, Chen Zhou's craftsmanship may have been lost. Lu Teng took a bow, pulled it casually, and said, "Don't worry." Chen Zhou walked 30 steps away, put the apple on his head, stood still, and said loudly, "Commander Lu, I'm ready." As soon as he finished speaking, Lu Teng knocked his bow and fired an arrow. A moment later, Chen Zhou turned around, picked up the apple-covered arrow, and trotted over. The arrow passed through the middle of the apple, exactly like the prairie man just now. A strange look appeared on the second prince's face, and he praised, "This general's archery skills are extraordinary. I didn't expect that some Han people are also good at archery." Tang Ning smiled and said, "Prairie people are good at riding and shooting, but those who are good at riding and shooting are not prairie people. It is true that the grassland people are good at riding and shooting, almost all the people are soldiers, but Lu Teng can also be regarded as the elite among Chen Guo's generals. This scene can be regarded as saving face for Chen Guo. In this kind of situation, if you are lost, you will soon, if word gets out, even if you return to Chen country, it will be a stain that cannot be washed away." The second prince looked at him and asked, "The winner has not yet been determined. How about we compete again? This time, it will be a 50-step competition." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Okay." The second prince threw an apple to the big man and said, "Houlihan, go ahead, I will compete with you this time." The big man took the apple and was about to leave when Tang Ning stretched out her hand and said, "Wait a minute." The second prince looked at him and asked, "Does Master Tang regret it?" Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "There is no point in competing like this. How about this? During the competition, let the other party hold the apple. If the person holding the apple is timid, that side will be considered the loser. How about this?" He looked at the second prince and said, "You still have to go first in this game. The second prince can choose anyone from our Chen state envoy. I wonder if the second prince dares." "Why don't you dare?" The second prince looked at him and said, "Why don't you choose Mr. Tang?" "I don't know if Mr. Tang dares." Tang Ning didn't answer and took the apple from the man's hand. Lu Teng hurriedly stepped forward and said, "Master Tang, you must not." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "It doesn't matter, I also believe in the second prince's archery skills." The second prince of Wanyan tribe, Wanyan Tao, is one of the people that Wanyan little man girl often talks about. This man is not only good at riding and shooting, but also proficient in sinology. Tang Ning can tell that Xiaoman barbarian girl worships him. 100 steps can pierce the willow is what Xiao Maniu said about him. She had just learned this idiom at that time, which shows that this humble second prince is not taking it for granted. Wan Yanyan ran over, glanced at Tang Ning, and said to the second prince, "Second brother, let me do this. Make him turn his back, and I will shoot his ass." The second prince raised his bow and said, "Yanur, don't be ridiculous." Wan Yanyan looked ahead and said, "Second brother, please be careful and don't shoot him to death. He is very cunning and full of bad ideas. I want to capture him and take him back to work for us." Li Tianlan walked out of the crowd, walked up to Tang Ning, and asked, "Are you crazy?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Don't worry, even if he misses the shot, I can still avoid it. The 100 life-saving tricks I learned from the old beggar before coming here are not in vain, they are enough to deal with these. Don't show off. Li Tianlan glanced at him and stood a few steps away from him. With her by her side, Tang Ning felt even more at ease. King Xian looked up, his brows furrowed, and his expression finally turned into helplessness. Tang Ning waved to the front, indicating that he was ready. Wang Yanyan looked at the second prince nervously and said, "Second brother, you must be careful." The second prince drew his bow and nocked an arrow, then slowly raised his arm. His eyes were not on Tang Ning, but on King Xian, who was diagonally behind him. The middle-aged woman beside him coughed slightly, and then he looked straight ahead, and his breathing gradually became steady. Wang Yanyan waved her hand forward and shouted loudly, "It's too early for you to admit defeat now." Tang Ning didn't speak. In fact, at this moment, he was so focused that he couldn't hear Wang Yanyan's words at all. "Call out." The second prince let go of his hand, and a black light disappeared in an instant. Boom! Tang Ning patted the apple crumbs on her head, turned around and walked about 10 steps, picked up the arrow, walked over and said, "The second prince is good at archery." The second prince put down his bow and said, "It's your turn. Who should I choose?" Tang Ning's eyes swept over the people in the grassland. When her eyes fixed on Wang Yanyan, she was startled and immediately hid behind a big man. Tang Ning said, "Why don't we choose the second prince?" The second prince raised his eyebrows slightly, and a big man immediately stepped forward and said a few words anxiously. "It doesn't matter." The second prince waved his hand, looked at Lu Tang, and said, "His archery skills are still better than yours, and 50 steps is not far for him." He took the apple and walked forward. Tang Ning looked at Lu Tang and asked, 50 steps, are you sure?" Lu Tang nodded and said, "No problem." "That's boring." Tang Ning took the bow and arrow from his hand and said, "Why don't you let me try it this round?" Lu Tang was stunned and asked, "Master Tang, does he know how to shoot archery?" Tang Ning didn't even know how to learn swordsmanship. She didn't know anything about archery. She shook her head and said, "If you know a little bit, you can try it first." Hirui hurriedly stepped forward and said, "Master Tang, you don't know how to shoot arrows. You should leave it to Commander Lu. If the shot misses." Tang Ning said nonchalantly, "If you miss, you miss. What does it matter if you lose a battle? Victory or defeat is a common thing in military affairs. Who has never lost in this life?" He raised his bow, and Wang Yanyan quickly ran over and asked in shock, "What are you going to do?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Shoot the apple." Wang Yanyan stood in front of him, put her hands on her hips and said, "Don't you know how to shoot arrows? Shoot a few more arrows and you'll understand." Tang Ning raised her bow and asked, "What do you think of this angle? It can just hit the apple." "No," Wang Yanyan stood in front of him and said hurriedly, "the arrow will fall when shot like this, and you will hit someone." "No way," Tang Ning shook her head and said, "I'll give it a try." "No," Wang Yanyan snatched the bow from his hand and said, "You are not allowed to shoot." Tang Ning looked at Honglu Temple Minister, spread his hands, and asked, "How do you calculate this?" Wang Yanyan pointed at him and said loudly, "You are cheating, it doesn't count." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "You two are playing 2 rounds. Commander Lu has already competed in 1 round just now. This round is my turn, why doesn't it count?" Wang Yanyan put her hands on her hips and said, "In short, it doesn't count." Little man girl was indeed still the same little man girl. She started to be unreasonable when she couldn't deal with people. Tang Ning looked at her and said, "If you don't want me to shoot the second prince, why don't you stand over and I'll shoot you, how about it?" The second prince walked over from the front, looked at Tang Ning, and said, "Yanner is right, Lord Tang is really smart." Wang Yanyan was dissatisfied and said, "When did I say he was smart? He is not smart at all, he is just cunning." The second prince said, "This time, we admit defeat." Tang Ning explained, "Actually, My archery skills are pretty good. Why don't the second prince give it a try? The second prince waved his hand and said, no need. This is how people are like each other. Tang Ning only put herself in danger if she trusted him, but his trust was only met with suspicion. This is naked human nature. The prairie people, who are famous for their bravery and riding and shooting, were completely defeated in the two fields they were most proud of. Not only did they lose, but they could not afford to lose. Until the banquet was over, and when they went back, Wang Yanyan looked at him with extremely serious eyes. Not kind, as if he wanted to eat him. Within the inn, Wang Yanyan, who had just returned, clenched her fists and gritted her teeth. I'm just saying that Tang is full of tricks. He will lose anyway. Second brother, you should shoot him in the butt with that sword. The second prince didn't care about this. He looked at her and said, Yanur, please go out first. Your master and I have something to say. Wang Yanyan walked out angrily, and then the second prince looked at the middle-aged woman and said, there are too many guards around King Xian, so we can't take action. If we miss this opportunity, we don't know when the next one will be. The middle-aged woman said, there is no way to get close to him, and the poisonous poison technique will not be of use. The second prince lowered his head and murmured, so, we must rely on the prince's power. This chapter is first published like Have Voice Novel Network. Please remember the URL. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiaorong. Chapter 383. The banquet at Honglu Temple was full of twists and turns, including wrestling and archery competitions. If you are not careful, you will lose the face of Chen Kuokuo. Fortunately, all these twists and turns were overcome safely. It was the prairie people who proposed the competition, and they were also the ones who were embarrassed. It is indeed impossible for the grassland people to live peacefully. A prince and a princess came from the Wanyan tribe. It is unlikely that they are just seeking peace. Destroying the relationship between Chen and Chu should be one of their purposes, and the second purpose should be to muddy the waters of Chu state. If they are lucky, at this juncture of emperor handover, if they take a wrong path, they will become it can bring a great country to decline. Not long after Tang Ning returned from Honglu Temple, another news came from the palace, inviting them to go to court with Chu officials tomorrow. Understood, we will go tomorrow. Hirui sent away the eunuch who delivered the order, and came back and said, Master Tang, Emperor Chu invited us to go to court tomorrow. Isn't it time to bring up the matter of marrying Princess Changning? Tang Ning did not answer immediately. Hirui looked up at him and hurriedly added, I am doing this for your lord's sake. After all, this is an errand entrusted to Lord Tang by His Majesty. If you ignore it, I'm afraid you will be criticized after you return. Master, he is still too impatient. Tang Ning looked at him and said, the current situation in Chu country is not clear yet. Maybe we have to take the princess back. Acting rashly will only make things worse. Hirui's eyelids twitched and he asked, this official is stupid. Can Mr. Tang explain it more clearly? Tang Ning looked at him and whispered, Master, do you think the prince can really become the emperor? Hirui was stunned, and after thinking about it carefully, he couldn't help but take a breath of cold air. Your Majesty married the princess because he was interested in the identity of the Prince of Chu. If the prince cannot become the emperor, then this marriage will be meaningless. At that time, I am afraid that we will still be at odds with the Chu state because of this. Tang Ning asked again, why do you think your Majesty ordered us to marry Princess Changning? Naturally, he wanted to marry Princess Changning because he wanted to deepen his relationship with Chu state. However, after he came to Chu state, he discovered that the Prince of Chu state and King Xian were inseparable, and Princess Changning was the daughter of King Xian, so marrying her would inevitably lead to, if you offend the prince, marrying the princess to the prince will offend King Xian. Hirui thought for a moment, then a look of surprise appeared on his face. He looked at Tang Ning and said, Master Tang means that you can only choose one or the other, marrying a princess or marrying a princess. Tang Ning smiled non-committally, and Hirui immediately held up her hands and said, I understand, I understand. After Hirui left, Tang Ning lay on the bed with her hands behind her head and frowned. The complicated situation in Chu State was a headache even for him. The most important point is that they are guests rather than hosts, and cannot turn passivity into initiative. They don't know when they will be able to break through the current predicament. He rubbed the center of his brow, and a pair of slender hands stretched out from the side, took his hand away, and gently rubbed it on his head. The massage was very stiff, far inferior to Xiao Ru. Tang Ning opened her eyes, he saw Zhao Man sitting beside his bed. Tang Ning sat up from the bed and immediately said, Princess. Zhao Man looked at him and said, Don't call me princess when there are no outsiders. Lie down quickly and I will press it for you again. Normally, Xiao Ru would give him a massage, which was a good way to relieve stress, but if it was Zhao Man, the psychological pressure would be even greater. Tang Ning shook her head and said, No, 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 it's not good for others to see. Zakaku, close the door. Zhao Man turned around and ordered. Seeing the palace maid closing the door, she turned around and said, This way no one will see. Tang Ning sat up and said, You are the princess and I am the subject. How can a princess serve a subject? I do. Zhao Man pushed him down on the bed and said, Lie down well. Now I'll press it down for you, and you'll help me draw my eyebrows later. We'll be even. Tang Ning was lying on the bed, looking at her attentively with her eyes open. Girls sometimes grow up so fast that it catches people off guard. Fang Xiaopang, who was addicted to food, grew up overnight. In half a year, he lost weight and became Fang Xiaoyu, and the full moon turned into a new moon. It only took less than half a year for Zhao Yingying to transform into Princess Zhao Man of Pingyang. He looked at her, her expression was focused, and although her movements were jerky, she was extremely serious. The feeling of being liked is always good, even if he will encounter many difficulties in the future. At this moment, Zhao Man made him feel that everything he had done before was worth it. Zhao Man's face turned red when he looked at him. She reached out to cover his eyes and said, Close your eyes and don't look. 3 days later, the Emperor of Chu, who was seriously ill, came to court again. This time, in addition to officials from the capital, there were also envoys from the state of Chen and envoys from the grassland. See His Majesty the Emperor. After the Chu courtiers had finished their rituals, the envoys from the 2 countries came. Emperor Chu's face looked paler than the previous 2 days, and he said softly, The envoy is exempt from courtesy. Thank you, His Majesty the Emperor. Everyone has come a long way and it has been a hard journey. Every time the Emperor of Chu spoke a word, he would pause, look at the envoy of Chen State, and said, There are many trivial matters in the court, and there has been a lot of neglect in the past few days. I have ordered the Ministry of Rites to find a good and auspicious day so that Princess Pingyang and the Crown Prince can get married as soon as possible. You don't have to worry. After he finished speaking, he paused for a long time, then looked at the messenger from the grassland and said, Although there are many conflicts between the grassland and our Chu country, since the Wanyan tribe wants to seek peace, our Chu country should uphold the principle of peace for the sake of nobility. We must not invade each other. Thank you, Your Majesty the Emperor. The second prince bowed and said, We are here this time to ask for something. Emperor Chu sat up straight and asked, What's the matter? The second prince took out a piece of cloth from his arms and said loudly, The little king has admired Princess Changning of your country for a long time. This trip is on the order of the Khan to plead to marry Princess Changning. He is willing to marry the Chu kingdom for eternity. So good. The second prince's words were still echoing in the hall, and many people's expressions changed. Although the courtiers of Chu State knew that the grassland people had just arrived in Chu State, they visited officials in a big way, and their words revealed that they wanted to marry with Chu state, but no one cared about it. After all, the envoys of the Chen state had already said similar things. Both the Chen state and the grassland wanted to marry Princess Changning, and they knew which one to agree to without even thinking about it. But the problem is that if what the second prince of the prairie said is true, a marriage can be used to exchange for peace between Chu and the prairie. This is tantamount to helping the Chu country get rid of the biggest threat, and the benefits it brings will be greater than it is much bigger than the princess marrying Chen Guo. But obviously, agreeing to the grassland means rejecting Chen Guo. Grassland is not easy to mess with, and Chen Guo is not easy to deal with either. Except for Tang Ning, all the Chen state envoys present had angry expressions on their faces. Asking to marry Princess Changning was one of the two major tasks of their trip, second only to escorting the princess to get married, but they were overtaken by the prairie people who came out of nowhere. If they lost to these prairie barbarians, how would they go back? Report to the court? Without waiting for the Emperor Chu or the courtiers to react, the second prince continued, although the grassland is barren, I am still willing to give you 3,000 war horses every year as a sincerity to marry the princess. I hope your majesty will agree. 3,000 grassland-produced war horses every year were a great temptation for the Chu state, and many people in the court had expressions of emotion on their faces. He Rui's expression changed slightly. He raised his head and looked at Tang Ning. After nodding, he stood up and said with cupped hands, I, the Chen state's envoy, are here on the orders of the emperor to marry Princess Changning. The second prince smiled, looked at him and said, Chen is a country of etiquette. Doesn't it mean that you don't understand the meaning of first come, first served? The second prince's words are wrong. Tang Ning stepped forward and said, the princess is not married yet, anyone can ask for her hand in marriage. Whoever proposes first will marry him, and your Princess Wanyan is not married yet. If I propose to marry your princess now, will you agree? Wanyan looked at him and secretly spat, you have a beautiful idea. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 384. Little Man Niu thought she couldn't hear her because of her low voice. Tang Ning glanced at her and said he was just giving her an example. He didn't want the little Mustang who liked to play with whips for free. If we say it's first come, first served, Tang's wedding envoy was before the second prince. He visited Prince Xian's mansion many times for the purpose of getting married. A voice came from the front, and everyone looked over. King Xian raised his head and looked at Emperor Chu, cupped his hands and said, both the Chen kingdom and the grassland want to get married. Your Majesty still needs to decide on this matter. Emperor Chu coughed a few times but did not speak, but suddenly there was a sound outside the palace. A eunuch hurriedly ran in from outside the palace. He tripped over the threshold and did not dare to delay. He ran into the palace, knelt down in panic, and said in a trembling voice, Your Majesty, the Chenzhou military camp is reporting urgently. General Su was arrested 2 days ago. An assassin sneaked into the military camp, killed General Su, and hung his head on the flagpole. What? As soon as the statement came out, the whole palace was in an uproar. Chenzhou is adjacent to Kyoto and is an important military town of the Chu state. It has always been heavily garrisoned. Once there is a change in Kyoto, the Chenzhou defenders can rush back to defend and arrive in one day. Because of the important task of guarding Kyoto, Chenzhou alone had 50,000 permanent soldiers. The defense was so tight. How could assassins be allowed to sneak into the military camp and take off the heads of the highest generals? Emperor Chu stood up from the dragon throne with difficulty and hissed, "What did you say?" Originally, Chen Guo and Grassland were competing for the title of Princess Changning. Due to this unexpected incident, the marriage proposal was temporarily put on hold. The general who was assassinated seemed to be of high rank. After such a vicious incident happened, the whole court was in chaos. Emperor Chu was too excited and his condition worsened. He was helped down, leaving King Xian to stabilize the overall situation. This was a court affair of the Chu state, and the envoys of the Chen state and the Grassland envoys were politely invited to go. A eunuch sent them to the entrance of the palace. Wang Yanyan and others returned to the inn, while Tang Ning and Lu Teng returned to Jingxia Palace. Greed is enough for a snake to swallow an elephant. The second prince looked at Tang Ning and said with a smile, "Chen Guo has married a princess and wants to marry a princess. Be careful that you will end up with nothing." This second prince not only dresses like a Han, he even talks like one. There are endless idioms and sayings, which is much better than Wang Yanyan, who is a dabbler. The second prince turned around and left after saying a word. Before leaving, Wang Yanyan habitually didn't give him a good look. Tang Ning thought that she had been trained to be more docile in that month, but she didn't expect the woman on the grassland. As expected, she was wild and untamed. After letting her go, she returned to her true nature within 2 days. Lu Teng walked beside him and said, "The Chu state is also very tempted by the conditions they proposed. It is not easy for us to compete with them." Tang Ning waved her hand, "Let's take one step at a time." In fact, to be honest, both the Chen kingdom and the grassland have their own agendas. For Chen Huang, it doesn't matter whether he marries the princess or the princess. What matters is winning the bet. For Tang Ning, neither will let the princess. Marrying the prince would not allow Prince Kong and Prince Duan to marry the princess. As for those prairie barbarians who secretly contacted the prince and openly asked to marry King Xian's daughter, who knows what they had in mind? In this situation, any abnormal movement will make you a target, so it is best to wait and see what happens. Back at the splendid palace, Tang Ning unexpectedly discovered that old Zheng was back. "I thought it would take him 10 days and a half to leave, but I didn't expect it to be so fast. Having him by my side is like taking a reassurance." He looked at Butcher Zheng and asked, "Is the matter done?" Butcher Zheng squatted on the porch, took a sip of wine, and said, "It's over." Tang Ning said, "It may take some time before we can go back." "There's no rush." Butcher Zheng wiped his mouth and said, "I'll go back with you then. This general of the Chu state is so dead." He Rui walked over with lingering fear, looked at Lu Teng and said, "Master Lu, you have to ask the soldiers to be careful and guard against those assassins, so as not to cause any trouble." Lu Teng said, "Don't worry, Master He. Not even a fly can fly into the princess's bedroom. Send more people to the envoys." He Rui said, then looked at Tang Ning and said, "Master Tang, those prairie barbarians have taken the lead in our marriage proposal. What will we do now?" Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Don't worry, Mr. He, I have my own arrangements." After lunch, Tang Ning took Chen Zhou and Lao Zheng to Prince Xian's mansion. When I walked to the door of Prince Xian's mansion, I found that the second prince and Wang Yanyan were also there. "Everyone, the prince has said that there will be no outsiders today, so please go back." Although the guard at the gate of the palace had a smile on his face, his tone was that of people who were thousands of miles away. The second prince looked inside and said, "Excuse me." Tang Ning came from behind, looked at them, and walked into the palace gate. The guard bowed and said, "Master Tang, please." "Stop." Wang Yanyan pointed at Tang Ning, looked at the guard, and asked angrily, "Didn't you say you don't want to see outsiders? Why can he go in?" Tang Ning turned around, looked at her, and said with a smile, "I'm sorry, we are not outsiders. As the savior of King Xian and Princess Xian, King Xian also wanted him to marry Junji. Although he refused, he could not be considered an outsider and would not be blocked from entering. Watching them walk in, Wang Yanyan stamped her feet and said angrily, "Why do you see him but not us? I'm so angry." The second prince did not show any surprise and said, "It seems that King Xian still favors Chen Guo." After looking at Yan Yan, he said, "Let's go." In Prince Xian's mansion, in the study, a young general looked at King Xian and said, "Your Majesty, General Su's death was mysterious. No clues have been found. I can't rule out that some enemies are coming to visit. Why don't we send someone to investigate?" A person next to him said, "He is a traitorous general of the Liang kingdom. How do we know if he had any enemies in the past?" King Xian did not speak, but someone came in from outside the door and said, "Your Majesty, Master Tang is here." King Xian raised his head and said, "You should step back first and let him come in." Tang Ning waited for the people in King Xian's study to come out before she stepped in. "What are you here for?" King Xian glanced at him and asked, "Are you asking for marriage for the prince of your Chen kingdom?" "Have I ever asked the prince to marry me?" Tang Ning looked at him and said, "The words I said in the palace today were the words of the prince himself." King Xian asked, "Are you really not here to ask for marriage?" Tang Ning said, "No." "Okay." King Xian walked to the table, took out a piece of paper, and said, "Why don't you sign a document here today? If you marry me one day, you will be struck by thunder and die." Tang Ning glanced at King Xian. There was really something wrong with this man. He did it for no reason. What kind of evidence did he establish? He took the initiative to come to him today because he had something important to discuss. The conflict between the Crown Prince and King Xian has long been irreconcilable. Only one of the two can be the emperor, and the other cannot have a good ending. For Zhao Yingying and Li Tianlan, Tang Ning naturally had to side with King Xian. Before that, he had to unite with King Xian before he could do anything. He looked at King Xian and said, "I came here to ask the prince, do you want to watch the emperor of Chu die and the crown prince ascend the throne like this?" King Xian looked at him and asked, "What do you want to say?" Tang Ning met his eyes and asked, "If the crown prince ascends the throne, will there still be room for Prince Xian's palace in the Chu kingdom?" Snapped. King Xian slapped his hand on the table and said, "Believe it or not, just based on what you just said, I can have people drag you out and chop you." Tang Ning naturally didn't believe it. If he dared to give this order, he would have died 100 times before those people rushed in. He continued to ask, "You don't think about yourself, the princess and the princess?" King Xian waved his hand and said, "I don't need you to teach me how to do things." After a few words, Tang Ning looked at him and said, "In that case, I'll take my leave. A prince who doesn't want to be an emperor is not a good prince. There are some people in this world who have unique advantages but insist on being a fish without dreams." Tang Ning decided to help this salt fish turn over for free. Who let him? Does this salted fish have a good daughter? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 385. Chapter 383 of the main volume of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun, Rumors in the Market. As a prince, King Xian has probably reached the pinnacle of what a prince can do. He is loved by all people and admired by all officials. In the position of prince, there is not much room for development. If he wants to climb up, the only way is to rebel and become emperor. Becoming emperor is no longer a question of whether he thinks about it or not, but the general trend. The lives of his family, his subordinates, and everyone are tied to his thoughts. After coming out of King Xian's study, Tang Ning did not go to find Li Tianlan, but went directly back to Jingxia Palace. Returning to his yard, he borrowed a knife from Chenzhou, stood in the yard, and made a slashing motion with the knife. Strength is the last word. No matter how busy he is, he will still take some time to practice every day. He didn't use any sword skills, he just simply swung the sword, over and over again. This is the method Lao Zheng taught him. Simple repetition, 10 times, 100 times, thousands of times, is more effective than any fancy knife skills. Butcher Zheng was leaning under a tree while drinking, looking up at the sky at a 45-degree angle from time to time. Tang Ning once thought that he was a rough guy selling meat, but along the way, she gradually discovered that old Zheng was also a man with a story. While waving his sword, he asked, "Old Zheng, do you think that if you were King Xian, would you rebel?" Butcher Zheng took a sip of wine and asked, "If it were you, would you do it?" Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, her movement of swinging the knife stagnant. The word rebellion doesn't sound very good, and it might bring him eternal infamy. More importantly, he has no ambition to be an emperor. All emperors in history are not short-lived. He still wants to live leisurely for a few more years. He put down the knife with a look of doubt on his face. Could it be that King Xian thought the same way? However, although he does not like to be an emperor, as a man, even if he has no ambition, he must still take some responsibilities. What kind of man is a man who cannot even protect his family, wife, and children? The small courtyard where he lived was guarded by beggar clan disciples. He walked outside the door, looked at one of them, and said, "Go and call Elder Ren." After a while, Ren Pingshen walked in from outside, raised his hands and asked, "Gang leader, what's the matter?" Ren Pingshen was considered to be the most flexible person among the senior members of the beggar clan. Tang Ning waved to him and said, "Sit down first. I have something to do for you." Letter to the palace. During lunch, Princess Xian put some food into King Xian's bowl. She remembered something and asked, "Have you found the murderer of General Su?" King Xian shook his head and said, "It's not easy to find the murderer without any clues. General Su will be assassinated in the camp." Princess Xian put down her chopsticks, looked at him, and said, "If the prince goes out, he should bring more people with him." As soon as she finished speaking, a figure walked in from outside the door and said, "Your Majesty, I have something important to report." King Xian put down his chopsticks and asked, "What's the matter?" The man looked up and hesitated to speak. King Xian looked at him, stood up, and said, "Let's go to the study and talk." "What's the matter?" "It's mysterious." Princess Xian watched him walk out, then looked at Li Tianlan and asked, "Why hasn't Tang Ning come to the palace in the past few days?" Li Tianlan bit his chopsticks and said, "Maybe he is busy." In the study, King Xian sat down, looked at the man and asked, "What happened?" The man looked up and whispered, "I don't know who they are, but they have spread some rumors about the prince in the market in the past few days, and they have spread all over Kyoto." King Xian looked at him and asked, "What rumors?" After the man took a deep breath, he said, "It is rumored that the queen mother was pregnant for 3 years before giving birth to the prince. When the prince was born, he could speak. On the night of his birth, a vision came from the sky, and a dragon hovered in the palace." King Xian stood up suddenly and said in surprise, "What?" After 3 years of pregnancy, he was able to speak when he was born, and there was a dragon hovering when he landed. These were all visions. In ancient times, those who had visions on their bodies were either saints or emperors. Although these rumors are not explicit, their implications are self-evident. The servant looked at King Xian and continued to speak. "The rumors also say that your Majesty is in the position of an emperor, and that your Majesty's ascension to the throne is God's will. There are also rumors that the prince is a disaster star and the source of disaster for the country. If the world is left in the hands of the prince, the Chu country will perish." "Stop talking," King Xian rubbed his eyebrows and said, "Let the ministers come over." Prince's mansion. The prince was full of anger, pacing in the palace, and said angrily, "What vision, what dragon, rebellion, he wants to rebel. Your Highness, calm down, Your Highness, calm down, Someone stepped forward and said, I have sent people to stop those who spread rumors. Anyone who spreads such rumors will be severely punished. The prince sat weakly on the chair, his chest heaving, and hissed, That's what they think in their hearts, what's the use of severe punishment? He thought for a while, gritted his teeth and said, In this case, I will never stop doing anything. The person next to him trembled and immediately said, Your Highness, that's not right. King Xian has many gang members in the capital. It would be good if he wins, but once he loses, there is no way to recover. The prince clenched his fists and said, I can't feel at ease until King Xian dies. The person beside him pondered for a moment and said, Your Highness, I have a plan. Maybe we can get rid of Prince Xian and let your Highness rest assured from now on. The prince turned his head, looked at him fiercely, and shouted, Speak. In Prince Xian's mansion. Watching the ministers leave, the young general behind Prince Xian asked, Your Highness, who else could it be if not these gentlemen? It doesn't matter. Prince Xian tapped the table with his index finger and said, Let someone clean up the villa outside the city. The princess and the princess will stay there for a while. The young general looked up at him and said, Yes. In the room, Princess Xian looked at Prince Xian and frowned and asked, Why do you want me and Lanlan to go to the villa outside the city? Prince Xian smiled and said, The weather has been hot recently. It's good for you and Lanlan to go out to avoid the heat. Princess Xian looked at him and suddenly said nervously, Did something happen? Prince Xian patted her hand and said, Don't worry, nothing will happen. He looked back at Li Tianlan and said, Take good care of your mother. Li Tianlan looked at him and nodded silently. Are you leaving? In Li Tianlan's room at Prince Xian's mansion, Tang Ning looked at her and asked, Where are you going? Li Tianlan said, To the courtyard outside the city. Every year at this time, my father would take my mother there to escape the heat. It's been quite hot these days, so it's good to go out and escape the heat. Tang Ning nodded and said, Kyoto has been too chaotic these days. The Crown Prince and Prince Xian have already made Kyoto restless. In addition, there are some people with ulterior motives who have been fanning the flames and spreading rumors in the market these days, making Prince Xian's fate seem so magical. I believe the Crown Prince is already very panicked. At this sensitive time, a small spark may trigger the final outbreak. Relatively speaking, it is quieter and safer outside the capital. He wanted to talk to Li Tianlan again, but a young general walked in from outside, looked at him, and said, Sir Tang, the prince invites you. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 386. The Young Master of Ruyi. Chapter 384. Planning. Tang Ning was led by the young general into the study of Prince Xian, and then closed the door and walked out. Prince Xian sat in front of the desk, picked up the teacup, and took a sip. Tang Ning looked around. There was no place for anyone to hide in Prince Xian's study. Even if he accidentally dropped the cup, 300 swordsmen would not jump out from the dark. Sit down. Prince Xian pointed to the seat opposite him. Tang Ning walked over and sat on the chair. Prince Xian put down his teacup, looked at him, and asked, I didn't know that when I was born, there was a dragon hovering on the top of the palace. How did you know that? Tang Ning looked puzzled and asked, What is the prince talking about? Prince Xian waved his hand and said, There are no outsiders here, so you don't have to pretend. Tang Ning shook his head and said, I don't know what the prince is talking about. You understand? Prince Xian looked at him for a long time before standing up and saying, I won't beat around the bush with you. I need you to do something. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, What is it? Prince Xian said, The prince will take action in 3 days. When that time comes, I need to borrow your people. Tang Ning was surprised and said, How do you know that the prince will take action in 3 days? Prince Xian did not answer. Tang Ning looked at him, pondered for a moment, and asked, What do you need me to do? After half an hour, Tang Ning walked out of Prince Xian's study. He walked out of the yard, and Li Tianlan, who had been waiting for a long time, came over and asked, "What did the king say to you?" Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "The prince talked to me about calligraphy, cursive script." Li Tianlan looked at him calmly and said, "I'll give you another chance. It's nothing serious." Tang Ning looked directly into her eyes and said, "It's just to discuss the rebellion." "It's not really a rebellion, it's just that the prince wanted to rebel, so he just cooperated with him." After a moment, Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "I want to stay in the city." "No, you have to protect the princess," just in case. Tang Ning shook her head firmly and said, "You have other tasks." "No. Be obedient." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "I feel at ease with you around." Li Tianlan clenched his fists, and it took a long time before he loosened his fists and nodded, "Okay." Tang Ning breathed a sigh of relief, looked at her, and comforted her, "Don't worry, nothing will happen." He originally thought that Prince Xian was just a salted fish who muddled through, but he didn't expect that he had a plan and deployment. This old fox is one thing on the surface and another behind the scenes, so he must be on guard in the future. Although Prince Xian's plan and preparation are very comprehensive, just in case, Tang Ning still wants to send Zhao Man out first. In Jingxia Palace, Zhao Man stared at him with wide eyes and asked, "Why do you want me to leave?" Tang Ning helped her frown and said, "It's not safe here these days. I will arrange for you to go out of the city to avoid it." Zhao Man looked at him and asked, "What about you?" "I have something important to do. I will pick you up in a few days." "No." Zhao Man stood up and said, "Wherever you are, I will be there." "Be obedient." Tang Ning pressed her shoulders and asked her to sit down, saying, "When this matter is over, we can go back." Zhao Man looked into his eyes and said seriously, "Even if I don't go back, I don't want you to take any risks." I know. Tang Ning pinched her nose and said, "I won't do anything I'm not sure of." High five. High five. Pa. Tang Ning stretched out his hand and touched her palm. In a hall of the imperial palace, the king of Chu lay on the couch, coughing non-stop. A royal doctor knelt on the ground and said in a trembling voice, "I am incompetent." The king of Chu waved his hand and said, "Go down." After the royal doctor lowered his head and retreated, an eunuch came in and whispered, "Your Majesty, Prince Xian has come down and is waiting outside." The king of Chu waved to the side, and two eunuchs came over and helped him lean against the head of the bed. After his breathing stabilized, he waved his hand and said, "Announce." Prince Xian walked in slowly, looked at the Emperor Chu leaning against the bed, and said, "Brother, you should lie down, it will save some energy." "There will be plenty of time to lie down in the future," the Emperor Chu said hoarsely, paused for a moment, and then asked, "How is the investigation of General Su's assassination going?" Prince Xian shook his head and said, "The murderer did not leave any clues, and there is no clue for the time being." The Emperor Chu said slowly, "Although he is not from Chu, he is capable enough. We must find the murderer." Prince Xian nodded and said, "I will have someone keep an eye on this case." The Emperor Chu paused again. After a while, he said, 3 days later, it will be the anniversary of my mother's death. Unfortunately, my health prevents me from going to pay tribute to her. I will accompany her well after I enter the underworld. The memorial ceremony 3 days later will be left to you." Prince Xian said, "Don't worry, my brother, I will make proper arrangements for my mother's memorial ceremony." The king of Chu looked at him and suddenly said, "I really miss the days when I ruled the world with you. If there were another 10 years, we would not have to pay tribute to the state of Chen and clear the threats on the grassland. Unfortunately, I will not see this day." When he said this, a trace of red appeared on his face, and even his breathing became much more rapid. King Xian stepped forward and said, "Brother, Please don't get excited. The redness on Emperor Chu's face gradually faded away, his breathing gradually became calmer, and he sighed, God has mistaken me. After a moment, he looked at King Xian again and said, the kingdom of Chu is in your hands, and it may last longer. King Xian cupped his hands and said, Brother, the emperor knows that I have no intention of doing this. I know. Emperor Chu nodded and said softly, I know. King Xian took 2 steps back and said, Brother, take a good rest. My mother needs to prepare for the ceremony. I will leave first. After King Xian walked out for a long time, Emperor Chu looked at the empty space and murmured, if the prince has 1/10 of his power, I can go there with peace of mind. Letter to the palace. A luxurious carriage stopped at the door of the mansion. Tang Ning stood beside the carriage, looked at Li Tianlan and said, be careful along the way, she will be taken care of by you. Li Tianlan looked back at the head that poked out of the carriage, nodded and said, be careful. King Xian stood beside him, watching the carriage go away, and said, you are so brave, you actually have an affair with the princess you are married to, even if you have several heads, you can't cut it off. Tang Ning automatically ignored these words of King Xian. She wanted to accuse him, so there was no reason to hesitate. He could feel that King Xian looked at him through colored glasses. Not only did he feel that he had an affair with the princess, he even felt that he and his my baby daughter has an affair. Tang Ning looked at him and confirmed, the prince is so sure that the prince will take action in 3 days. King Xian looked at him and said calmly, if you hadn't spread rumors everywhere and pressed you every step of the way, he wouldn't be so anxious. In fact, Tang Ning herself did not expect that things would develop so smoothly. Ren Pingsheng prepared a package plan. Rumors were only the first step. In addition, he found someone to write a form of persuasion to enter. Before the slogan Great Chu is prosperous, respect the King of Trust was shouted out, the people were already in a state of excitement. It seemed that besides them, there was a pair of invisible hands pushing all of this. At first, Tang Ning thought it was King Xian himself, but now it seemed that it wasn't. Prince's mansion. The prince looked at a counselor and asked, how sure are you? The counselor said, Prince Xian's mansion is heavily guarded, and it is adjacent to the city patrol. No matter how many people he brings, he cannot break through it. But as long as King Xian leaves the palace and the guards are weak, it will be much easier for your highness to take action. Get rid of Xian King, there is no one who can compete with his highness. The prince frowned and asked, when will he leave the palace? The other times are not certain. The counselor looked at him, his eyes flashed, and said slowly, but 3 days later, at the ceremony of the late Queen Mother, King Xian will definitely appear, at that time, His Highness will best chance. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 387. The Queen Mother's Ceremony. The prince gritted his teeth and repeated it several times before saying, there will indeed not be many guards at the Queen Mother's ceremony, but how will we do it then? The young counselor said, Your Highness, do you know who the guards at the Queen Mother's ceremony are? I will participate in the festival every year, so I naturally know it. The prince looked at him and said, at the festival, there will be 300 forbidden troops responsible for security and order, but these 300 forbidden troops are not my private army. But these 300 people are not the city patrol officers or the guards of Prince Xian's palace. The young counselor looked at him and said, the Queen Mother's ceremony will be held at Siwei Temple outside the city. King Xian will definitely leave the city by then, and it is impossible to bring the Queen Mother with him. There are many guards, but these 300 forbidden troops are loyal to His Majesty, as long as His Majesty. The young counselor looked at the prince. Before he finished speaking, the prince had already understood. His expression moved and he said, "If I can control these forbidden troops, then won't King Xian be the fish on my chopping board?" He walked around the hall and said, "Prepare the carriage. I am going to go find the Grand Tutor to discuss the matter. In addition, just in case, I will send someone to the inn to summon the second prince of those barbarians." Station. As the sky grew dark, the second prince got off the carriage and walked into the inn. The middle-aged woman stepped forward and asked, "Why is the prince so anxious to find his highness?" The second prince walked into the room and said slowly, "The prince is finally going to take action. Once King Xian dies, as long as the Chu kingdom is under his control, our army will have no worries." Wang Yanyan asked doubtfully, "Second brother, you won't marry that princess?" The second prince said, "Asking to marry Princess Changning is just a way to deceive and blind people. Although she is proficient in civil and military affairs, she can never be used by us. There are only two purposes for this trip, to destroy the Chen-Chu alliance and get rid of King Xian. There's another one." Wang Yanyan looked at him and added, "It's best to take that man named Tang back and let him give us advice. If he cheats, we'll whip his ass with a whip." The middle-aged woman looked at her and asked, "What does the prince want us to do?" "Before the prince takes action, he will ask the imperial guards in the city to close the city gate and prevent the soldiers from the city patrol department from rescuing. In this way, the 300 forbidden troops from Siwei Temple will be enough to capture King Xian." The second prince said at the table. He sat down in front of us and said, "These 300 people are all the power the prince can use that day. Just in case, he asked our people to support him outside to ensure nothing goes wrong." His eyes were slightly sharp and he said, "At that time, if King Xian dies and the prince's side is not harmed, it will be considered as the icing on the cake. It can be exchanged for 10 years of peace with the Chu state and unify all the ministries in one fell swoop. If both sides suffer losses, the prince of the Chu state will be killed. Also get rid of it easily. By then, Chu state will be in chaos. Chu state will be too busy to take care of itself. Naturally, it will not care about the alliance with Chen state. The deadlock on the grassland can also be resolved." Wang Yanyan tightened her grip on the small whip and said, "It would be great if it really goes that well." Splendid palace. In Tang Ning's room, both Lu Teng and Chen Zhou were present. Lu Teng looked at Tang Ning with a solemn expression and asked, "Sir, the Crown Prince of Chu is going to attack King Xian. Is this news true or false? We are far away in Chu. If we make a wrong move, the princess will be in danger." Tang Ning said, "Don't worry about the princess, I have secretly sent her away." Lu Teng was shocked and said, "When did you send the princess away? How come I didn't know?" "This is not the point." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "The point is that the Chu kingdom is undergoing great changes. What should we do to preserve the mission?" After Lu Teng calmed down, he thought for a while and said, "I think we just need to do our own thing well. There is no need to interfere in the dispute between King Xian and the prince. After all, the prince and the princess are still married. If the prince wins, it's good for us, but if King Xian ascends the throne, wouldn't this marriage be invalidated?" Cough. Cough. Chen Zhou covered his mouth and coughed twice, looked at Lu Teng and said, "Commander Lu, I think Master Tang is right. We have been in Chu for so long, Commander Lu should already know what the prince's character is like. If Chu is if it falls into his hands, it will end sooner or later. It is better to help King Xian and maybe get a favor. Besides, what is the status of the princess? How can the good-for-nothing prince of Chu state be worthy of the princess?" "Mr. Tang, you say so." Lu Teng thought for a while, looked at Tang Ning, and said, "I will listen to Mr. Tang's arrangements." Along the way, many incidents showed that Tang Ning was right. Before coming, he did not expect that the situation in Chu state would be so complicated that he would not be able to make a choice. At this time, listening to smart people is obviously the best choice. Tang Ning nodded and said, the Queen Mother's ceremony will be held at Siwei Temple outside the city. In 3 days, King Xian and the Crown Prince will leave the city. This is the Crown Prince's best opportunity. He will definitely have people block the city gate after leaving the city. Once the 300 forbidden troops who prevent the city patrol department from rescuing and are responsible for the safety of the festival are captured by the prince, King Xian will have no choice but to capture them. Lu Teng looked solemn and said, what can we do? Tang Ning looked at him and said, Princess, I have sent her to a safe place. I need you to move our 800 guards out of the city in these 3 days and place them nearby Siwei Temple. If something goes wrong during the ceremony, we will rescue King Xian from the hands of the prince. Lu Teng pondered for a moment, then cupped his hands and said, take your orders. Jiwei Temple is located on a hill more than 10 miles outside of Kyoto. The temple is not very popular, but it is very famous in Kyoto. This is because the previous emperor built this temple to commemorate the empress, the late Empress Dowager. The current emperor and His Royal Highness Prince Xian, who is in the high position of regent, are both born to the Empress Dowager. Since His Majesty ascended the throne, the emperor and Prince Xian would personally go to the Siwei Temple to worship at every Empress Dowager's festival. Now that the emperor is seriously ill, Prince Xian will be in charge of this year's Empress Dowager's festival. The prince, as the crown prince, will also go out of the city to worship. The mighty team set out from Kyoto at the hour of SI, and the festival officially began at noon. The prince sat in the front carriage, clenched his fists, sweat dripped from his forehead, and asked in a deep voice, haven't we reached Siwei Temple yet? A man outside the carriage said, Your Highness, it's just a few miles ahead. I know. Inside the carriage, the prince wiped the sweat from his palms with a clean handkerchief, and an abnormal blush appeared on his face. It was a distance of several miles, but it was reached in a flash. The abbot of Siwei Temple had already led the monks to wait outside the temple. He stepped forward and called out a Buddhist name, and said, Siwei Temple Abbot Kongming greets the prince and the prince. The prince looked at the abbot with a somewhat unpleasant expression. In the state of Chu, the prince was second only to one person and above 10,000 people. This old monk first met the prince and then the prince, and it was clear that he did not take him, the crown prince, seriously. However, compared with the big things he was going to do next, he didn't care about this little thing. Master, please don't bow. Prince Xian held his hands together and asked, how are the preparations for the ceremony going? The old monk put his hands together and said, everything is ready. Please come in, Your Majesty. Prince Xian looked at the prince and said, please come in, Prince. The prince smiled and said, Uncle, please come in first. Prince Xian was the first to step into the temple gate. The prince and the leader of the imperial guards looked at each other and also stepped in. The Queen Mother's ceremony has always been supervised by the Ministry of Rites. In addition to the officials of the Ministry of Rites, some important officials in the court also have to accompany the ceremony. In a hall in the temple, Prince Xian and the prince stood in the front, followed by more than 10 important officials in the court. The Minister of Rites stepped forward, looked at Prince Xian, and said with a bow, Your Highness, the auspicious time has arrived, we can start. As soon as he finished speaking, the prince suddenly covered his stomach and said, Uncle, I suddenly feel uncomfortable in my stomach, you guys start first. Before he finished speaking, he quickly stepped back. When he retreated to the door, he showed ecstasy on his face and shouted, Let's do it. This chapter is first published on AIU Voice Novel Network, please remember the website address. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 388. One moment the prince was clutching his stomach and showing pain, but in the next moment he became lively and uttered shocking words. The Minister of Rites, who was about to preside over the ceremony, frowned and turned around and said, Your Majesty, This is the ceremony for the Queen Mother. Please don't mess around. What nonsense, a sneer appeared on the prince's face, and he waved his hand, take them all down. After a burst of rapid footsteps, dozens of soldiers armed with weapons rushed in, surrounding King Xian and others. The expression of the middle official changed drastically. The Minister of Rights looked at the prince and said in shock, Your Majesty, what do you want to do? The prince was already overjoyed. He stepped forward and said, King Xian relied on the trust of his father to cause chaos in the court with the intention of treason. You rebellious officials and traitors are colluding together to subvert the government. I must correct the chaos and eliminate harm for the country. The several guards beside King Xian were already facing a formidable enemy. They were guarding King Xian behind them and facing off against the troops in front. However, the 4 guards could only resist for a moment against dozens of troops. Prince, you. The Minister of Rights pointed at him, his arms trembling, and then looked at the soldiers and asked, do you want to rebel? Rebellion, the prince said with an angry look on his face, I am the prince and the heir apparent, who is plotting rebellion. King Xian put the burning incense in his hand into the incense burner and then slowly turned around. A guard beside him solemnly said, Your Majesty, I will escort you out. Get out, the prince sneered and said, You think you can still get out? This place has been surrounded by my people. No one of you can get out today. Boom. As soon as he finished speaking, a guard next to King Xian took out a bamboo tube from his arms and lit the fuse outside. A dazzling firework shot out of the bamboo tube and exploded in the distance outside the door. You still want to find someone to rescue you, the prince looked at him and said with a smile, To tell you the truth, the 4 gates of Kyoto have been closed now, and no one can get out. King Xian took 2 steps forward, looked at the prince, and asked, Why is this so? Why is this happening? When the prince heard this, he was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on, and asked loudly, You ask me why this is happening? Why don't you ask yourself first? It's wrong to believe that the king is not good enough. What kind of regent, what kind of real dragon comes to the world, the master of destiny? You want to rebel and become the emperor, and you actually ask this palace. The soldiers who broke in rushed step by step, and more than a dozen officials from the central government turned pale and kept retreating. The Minister of Rights smiled sadly and said, I regret it, if the prince could have raised his arms, deposed the prince and ascended the throne, how could things happen now? It is not a pity for me to die. It is a pity for the people of Chu state. What a pity to the people of this world. King Xian shook his head and said, How can I, the king, rebel and leave an eternal infamy in the history books? If I can serve in the same dynasty as the prince, I will be content to be a lower-ranking official. The Minister of Rights sighed and said, The cause of the past and the result of the present are all destiny. The prince looked at everyone inside coldly, took 2 steps back, and said, Kill them all, leave no one behind. As soon as he finished speaking, a general hurried over and said, Exit, it's bad. A large number of people appeared outside the temple and surrounded us. What? The prince's expression changed and he asked, How many people are there? Who are they? The general said, They are more than twice as many as us. I don't know who they are yet. Let them hold on first, we still have backup, the prince said calmly, pointed at King Xian, and said loudly, Kill him first, kill him. As you command. The general responded, and then with a clang, he pulled out the long knife from his waist and put it on the prince's neck. After feeling the coldness on his neck, the prince stood still, looked at the general, and said in a trembling voice, You. The general held the prince hostage, looked at the army in front, and said sternly, Put down your weapons. Dozens of soldiers looked at each other, clenching and relaxing their weapons, not knowing what to do. The prince attempted to murder the regent. I have informed your majesty about the matter and left it to your majesty to decide. The general looked at everyone and said loudly, "Why don't you put down your weapons quickly?" The soldiers looked at each other and slowly put down their weapons. The general looked at King Xian, lowered his head and said, "The prince is frightened." When Tang Ning led his troops into the building, the troops inside were already kneeling on the ground. In fact, when he just broke in, the guards outside didn't put up much resistance. Several army leaders were the first to surrender, and they hardly spent any time. The situation was under control with little effort. He looked at King Xian, who looked calm, and finally realized that even without their presence today, King Xian could easily control the situation. Looking at the prince who was slumped on the ground with an extremely dazed look on his face, as if the whole world had collapsed, he could only think of something wrong in his heart. Even he couldn't see how many tricks King Xian had. If a prince at this level wanted to fight him, he was still far away. Take the prince down. King Xian looked at the prince, looked at the Minister of Rites, and said, "Master Zhang, the ceremony continues." The ceremony of the Queen Mother was interrupted for a moment and then continued. The 300 surrendered guards were temporarily taken over by Lu Tang. Tang Ning walked outside. Butcher Zheng looked at him and asked, "Are you not moved at all?" Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Why are you tempted?" "The lives of the Crown Prince and King Xian all depend on your thoughts." Lao Zheng clasped his hands and said, "As long as you issue an order, the Chu kingdom will be in chaos." Having said that, one of his ideas at this moment can completely change the pattern of Chen Chu and the grassland, but the Chu country is in chaos, which will not do him any good. Once the Chu state is weakened and the grassland takes advantage of the situation, the next unlucky one will be the Chen state. He has no reason to do this. More importantly, although King Xian is cunning, he is still Li Tianlan's father. If he kills King Xian, how will he face her in the future? Tang Ning looked around and saw that the situation in the temple was completely under control. She sighed inwardly. The princess is pure and innocent like a little white flower, and the princess is kind. How could she have such a cunning fox-like father and husband? He walked outside the temple, looked up, and saw more than 100 shadows not far away. Wang Yanyan stood a few steps away, looked at him, and asked nervously, "Why are you here?" "I came out to relax, but I happened to see the prince trying to murder King Xian, so I saw an injustice on the road and came to help." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Why are you bringing so many people here?" Wang Yanyan looked at him, her teeth clenched, with a look of disbelief. "To relax? Are there any people who bring hundreds of fully armed people to relax?" "What a coincidence, we came here to relax." She looked at Tang Ning and said, "Now that we're done, we're going back." Stop. Chen Zhou strode out, looked at the second prince and others, and said, "This is where the Queen Mother's ceremony is held. You people are sneaking here, you must have some intention." He waved his hand and said, "Take them all down." "How dare you?" Wang Yanyan pulled out a small leather whip. The second prince stopped her, looked at Chen Zhou and said, "You are just envoys of the Chen state, I'm afraid you don't have this power yet." Chen Zhou looked at him and said, "This matter is of great importance. We have been entrusted by King Xian to guard the area around Siwei Temple. You and your group are acting suspiciously. You should stay here until the matter is investigated." The second prince snorted coldly, "How can I, the king, be threatened by you?" After he finished speaking, more than 100 people behind him showed their weapons at the same time. After Tang Ning, countless people also rushed out and surrounded them. Tang Ning looked at the hundreds of people opposite and frowned slightly. There are many fierce soldiers in the grassland. These people are not weak in fighting ability. They are far superior to Lu Tang's soldiers. If we fight with them, even if we win, we will suffer heavy casualties. What's more, the situation is uncertain at this time. If they are left behind, there will be more casualties. If some variables occur, Trusting the king is the most important thing, so don't cause too many troubles. He glanced at Chen Zhou and shook his head slightly. After Chen Zhou understood, he immediately looked at the second prince and said, "Who knows if you have anything to do with the murder of King Xian? I can let you go, but you must keep a hostage. Wait until the matter is found out and it has nothing to do with you, then let her go." The second prince and the middle-aged woman looked at each other, looked back, pointed at someone, and said, "Ahulai, you stay." Chen Zhou glanced at Tang Ning, pointed at Wang Yanyan, and said, "You can all leave, but she stays." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 389. Although the warriors on the grassland are brave, they are not numerically superior. If the two parties really start a fight, their side will definitely be destroyed. Wang Yanyan looked at it and said, "Second brother, you go first, I will stay." "Be careful yourself." The second prince glanced at her and said, "Let's go." Chen Zhou looked at Wang Yanyan, who looked unhappy, then looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Master Tang, do you want to tie her up?" Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "No need, just let a few people watch her." He had no intention of keeping Wang Yanyan just now. Chen Zhou was pretty good at making decisions on his own, but it was fine to keep her. The second prince brought so many people to Siwei Temple this time. They were definitely not here for a walk, they were the prince's colleagues. The party's possibility accounted for a large part, but it was a pity that they came too late. It seemed that they came to the door on their own initiative and did not ask for it. Tang Ning looked at Wang Yanyan and asked, "Is the second prince your biological brother?" Wang Yanyan glared at him, "I want you to take care of it." A biological brother generally wouldn't be able to let his sister stay as a hostage. If it were Tang Ning, let alone his own sister, he wouldn't be able to do it. No matter who wanted to harm Xiao Xiao, he would definitely fight them tooth and nail. Tang Ning crossed her arms, looked at her, and asked, "Tell me honestly, are you here to help the prince kill King Xian?" Wei Nianyan snorted coldly and said nothing. "At this time, you should firmly say no." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "If you don't speak, you are acquiescing. Do you know how serious the crime of murdering the regent is? Even the prince cannot bear it. Wait until the prince confesses you. You don't have enough heads to chop off." Wei Nianyan gritted her teeth and said, "No. It's too late to say yes now." Tang Ning looked at her, sighed, and said, "Beheading is not enough to atone for murdering the royal family. It is very likely that Lingqi will be executed. Do you know what Lingqi is?" Wang Yanyan raised her head and looked at him, with a tremor in her voice. "What is it?" Tang Ning explained very responsibly, "Lingqi will make 3,600 cuts on your body. Each cut will remove a piece of flesh. It will last for 3 days and 3 nights. During this process, you will not die. You have to wait until I will give you a happy ending when I take the last cut." Wang Yanyan turned pale, covered her ears, and shook her head violently. "I won't listen, I won't listen, I won't listen, my second brother will come to save me." Little Maniu's mind is still immature. If the prince's murder of King Xian has nothing to do with them, she will naturally be let go. No one will need to rescue her. At this moment, she is simply not asking for it. Since the second prince chose to leave at this time, he probably won't come back again. The Chu kingdom is about to change hands. To murder King Xian is to commit regicide. Before the chaos is settled, run as far as you can to save your life. Act of. The second prince is a smart man and will not fail to understand this. Tang Ning ignored Wang Yanyan and walked into the temple. The once arrogant prince was being escorted by 2 guards. A look of rage suddenly appeared on his face. In an instant, he broke away from the guards and ran wildly outside the temple. "I am the crown prince, you treacherous ministers and traitors, who dares to arrest me?" Chen Zhou jumped up, kicked him to the ground, waved his hand and said loudly, "Bring the rope." After a while, the prince had a ball of rags stuffed in his mouth and was tied up in a familiar way. Even though he was being held captive, he was still struggling. Chen Zhou stood beside him with a look of triumph on his face. After waiting in the temple for half an hour, King Xian came out and said, "City." When leaving the city, there were only more than 300 people, but when entering the city, there were more than 1,000 people. As a group of people headed toward the city gate, on a boat 20 miles away from Kyoto, a man looked anxious and chattered to the second prince. The second prince looked calm and said, "The prince was defeated and captured. The Chu kingdom has fallen into the hands of King Xian. If you don't take advantage of this moment to seize the throne, King Xian will have no time to take care of him. Leave as soon as possible. When he calms down the overall situation, he will come to us to settle the matter when." The man said, "But Princess Yanner is willing to stay for us. If we go now, wouldn't we be letting her down? Wait until we go and find a way to save her." The second prince looked at the cabin and said, "Let them sail the ship." The man turned his head, looked at the middle-aged woman, and said anxiously, "Master." The middle-aged woman looked at the water and said, "Let the second prince arrange it." When more than 1,000 people arrived at the city gate, the gate was closed tightly. Wei Nianyun looked around, with a look of confusion on her face. A general stepped forward and shouted, "Open the city gate." There was no movement at the city gate. Inside the city gate, the Ministry of War led the officers of the City Patrol Department to confront the imperial troops guarding the city gate from a distance. The Ministry of War looked at the general of the Forbidden Army and said loudly, "Captain Chen, what do you mean?" The Forbidden Army general said expressionlessly, "I also want to ask Lord Shang what you mean. What is your purpose of taking these soldiers out of the city?" The Ministry of War still said, "Someone wanted to do harm to the prince. I received the news and went to rescue. But you stopped me. Could it be that you wanted to murder the prince?" The general of the Forbidden Army said calmly, "Master Shang, this hat is too much. The city patrol department does not patrol properly, but has to lead troops out of the city. If I let you out, how will I explain to your majesty? It is your duty, I hope you will forgive me." As soon as he finished speaking, a man hurriedly came down from the city wall and whispered a few words in his ear. "What took you so long?" he frowned and said, waving his hand and saying, "Open the city gate." The Minister of War watched the city gate slowly open, his face changed slightly, his eyes fixed on the city gate, his expression extremely nervous. The carriage slowly drove into the city gate, and the general of the Imperial Guards looked at the crowd behind him, his face changed, and he was shocked. Why are there so many people? At this time, a man stepped forward and said, "The prince disrupted the Queen Mother's ceremony and intended to murder Prince Xian. He has been captured and is waiting for His Majesty's decision. His Royal Highness Prince Xian has ordered that the 300 rebels will be temporarily detained by the Patrol City Division, and the duty of guarding the city will also be temporarily handed over to the Patrol City Division." The general of the Imperial Guards was stunned in place, and it took a long time for him to come to his senses. He bowed and said, "I obey your order." The prince failed in his attempt to murder the regent. No matter what, he could not sit in the position of the crown prince again. The people would not tolerate him, and the court would not tolerate him. From today on, the world of Chu will be reversed and the world will change. After the Ministry of War sent people to take in the rebels and take over the city gate, he walked to the carriage, looked at Prince Xian, and asked, "Your Highness, is this the palace?" Prince Xian waved his hand and said, "Enter the palace." The Ministry of War's face changed, and he immediately said, "Your Highness, think twice. Although they have captured the prince, and they have the Patrol City Division and control the city gate, there are still countless Imperial Guards stationed in the palace, which is not something they can control at all. Moreover, the 300 Imperial Guards can be dispatched by the prince, and the imperial guards guarding the city closed the city gates and stopped them at the critical moment. This is not something a prince can do at all. At this moment, the palace is a dragon's den and a tiger's lair for Prince Xian, who can only enter but not leave. The most important thing to do at this moment is to send a message out. Many of the major military divisions and important towns in the capital are loyal to Prince Xian. Within 3 days, reinforcements will arrive. This is the safest way. The prince made a mistake, so he must go to the palace to see the emperor. Please make the decision, Your Majesty. Prince Xian looked at him and asked, what else? Rebellion. Although Tang Ning also felt that it was not a good idea for Prince Xian to go to the palace at this moment, he could not guess how many tricks this old fox had, but he thought that he must have the confidence to go to the palace. At the gate of the palace, Prince Xian got off the carriage with only a few guards. He looked at the person beside him and said, untie the prince. After the rope was untied, the prince said sadly, Uncle, I was wrong, I was really wrong, please forgive me. Prince Xian looked at him and said calmly, come with me to see His Majesty. The prince lowered his head, his face full of remorse, and seemed to have accepted his fate. But deep in his eyes, there was still a trace of extreme hatred and expectation. This is the palace, not the patrol department, nor the Prince Xian's mansion. He has not lost yet, he still has a chance. When the group entered the palace, an eunuch came forward and said, Your Majesty, His Majesty is waiting for you in the Yangshen Palace. Yangshen Palace. When he reached the door of the palace, the prince rushed in before Prince Xian, ran to the bed, and cried, Father, Father, save me, my uncle wants to kill me, he wants to rebel. His voice was sad and his tears were streaming, but at a certain moment he stopped and looked at a person in the palace. Looking at his most trusted advisor who had given him countless advice and planned the assassination of Prince Xian, the prince was stunned and blurted out, Why are you here? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 390. Emperor Chu wanted to sit up on the bed, but King Xian took 2 steps forward and carefully helped him up. The prince was full of doubts about why his advisor appeared here. Emperor Chu leaned on the bedside and said, I already know what happened today. The prince came to his senses and immediately said, Father, Uncle Wang wants to rebel. Emperor Chu looked at him and said slowly, if your Uncle Wang wanted to rebel, he would have rebelled a few years ago and would not have waited until now. The prince's expression was stunned, he looked at him in disbelief, and murmured, Father. Emperor Chu looked at him, covered his mouth, coughed a few times, and said, Father has taught you a long time ago that to be an emperor in a peaceful and prosperous era, you can be without talent or without virtue. To be an emperor in a troubled era, the emperor must be talented and virtuous so that the country can continue. The prince looked at Emperor Chu, as if he had realized something, and his face gradually turned pale. The kingdom of Chu rose from humble beginnings, and it took several generations of emperors to rule the world. Today Emperor Chu looked at him and sighed, for the sake of the country, and the people, I cannot let you destroy the foundation of the Li family. The prince's face changed wildly. He looked at the counselor, at King Xian, then at Emperor Chu, and suddenly laughed and said, It turns out you have a plan, it turns out you are in the same group, liars, you are all liars, give me back my country, give me my country. Emperor Chu closed his eyes and said, Take the prince down. 2 imperial guards took the prince down, and Emperor Chu slowly opened his eyes, looked at King Xian, and asked, The prince's moral character is corrupt and he intends to murder the regent. I have decided to depose the prince and officially pass the throne to you. Are you satisfied? King Xian sighed softly and said, Brother Huang is pressing on every step of the way, Isn't it just for today? There is nothing I can do. Emperor Chu sighed and said, there are wolves in front and tigers in the back. Our country of Chu seems to be ruling the world, but in fact it is surrounded by foreign enemies. It is better to be a deposed prince than a king who has subjugated the country. Much more. After so many years, my brother has not changed at all. King Xian shook his head and said, it was like this when I asked my brother to be regent, and it is like this now. Emperor Chu said, being born into the royal family, this is my duty, and it is also your duty. King Xian said, this is the duty imposed on me by the emperor. Emperor Chu looked at him with a smile on his face and said, don't worry about these things between brothers. King Xian said, brothers must also settle accounts openly. Emperor Chu shook his head and said, after so many years, you haven't changed at all. Back then, we secretly ran out of the palace to fish without telling my father. Your bait was not given to me at all, my father arranged it for me. My homework is twice as much as yours, and you never help me share it. King Xian said leisurely, father taught us that we should do our own things by ourselves. Emperor Chu asked, so you would rather be poisoned than help me take care of this world? King Xian nodded and said, poisoning is a temporary thing, but governing a country takes a lifetime. This is a headache for the imperial brother. Why should we embarrass my brother? Because I am jealous. Emperor Chu looked a little angry and said, I have been more tired than you since I was a child. My father wants me to be the best at everything. My schoolwork is twice as much as yours, and I only have your time to sleep. Half of me, I also want to be an idle prince, doing nothing all day long. You don't know how much I envy you. I'm fine now. His frown relaxed, I can finally have a good sleep. After so many years, I haven't had a good night's sleep. King Xian helped him lie down, covered him with a quilt, and said, brother, please have a good rest now. No, I still have some things to do. It's not too late to sleep. After I finished talking, he looked at King Xian and said, although Zhir has no talent or virtue, he is my flesh and blood after all. I can't give him the throne, so you can help me. May he be rich and prosperous for the rest of his life. King Xian nodded and said, my brother obeys the order. Emperor Chu paused for a moment before continuing, if one day you are tired, then see if there are any talents in the royal family that can be made. You may not be the emperor, but the inheritance of the Li family cannot be broken. King Xian said, my brother has written it down. There is one last thing. Emperor Chu looked at the side of the bed and said, let's draw up the decree. There were already people in the hall who had prepared pen and paper and were listening intently. I have inherited the great cause of Emperor Jiaozu and Emperor Taizong for 16 years, and hereby I have worked conscientiously, showing consideration to my ministers, benefiting the people, and maintaining order in the world. The Prince Li Ji has violated the virtues of our ancestors, disrespected my instructions, and only committed evil. He is violent and promiscuous, bringing harm to the people, and it is hard to get out of his mouth. Now, Prince Li Ji is deposed and denounced as a commoner. Emperor Chu was lying on the bed. After finishing this sentence, he paused for a long time before speaking again. My virtue moves the sky, and the jade scale carries the preface, the poor gods know it, and the billions of signs return to my heart. It has been 16 years since I was ordered by the late emperor to live among the people. Now that I have been suffering from chronic illness for a long time, I am unable to govern the country. Don't dare to worry about the world. King Li Shun has been regent for many years. He has a noble character and numerous achievements. I am convinced that he will be able to inherit the throne and succeed me to the throne, that is, the emperor. I will announce it to the world and send envoys to hear about it. These two imperial edicts, one is to depose the prince, and the other is to pass the throne. When he read to the second chapter, he had to pause for a long time every time he said a sentence. It took a long time to say just a few words. After finishing speaking, He slowly closed his eyes and said, "I'm tired, you all should step aside." He was lying on the bed with his eyes slightly closed and his expression peaceful. King Xian clenched his fists, then quickly released them. He bowed down and whispered, "My brother, please leave." Outside the palace, the soldiers of the Patrol City Division have surrounded the palace gate, looking inside with vigilant eyes. Inside the palace, the imperial guards are fully armed, as if facing a great enemy. The streets of Kyoto have long been deserted. The people are hiding in their homes, panic-stricken, and the officials have no intention of going to the government office. They stay in their homes, occasionally looking in the direction of the palace, with trepidation on their faces. The news that the prince intended to murder the regent during the Queen Mother's festival spread throughout Kyoto in a very short time, and Prince Xian has been in the palace for a long time. Kyoto, which has been suppressed for a long time, finally changed completely today. The conflict between Prince Xian and the prince also broke out today. The prince murdered the regent, which is not tolerated by the law and the people. If your majesty deposes the prince, then the prince will never have a chance to ascend the throne. If your majesty does not depose the prince, Prince Xian will definitely be eliminated. Whoever walks out of the palace gate today is related to the future of Chu state. Everyone is worried, and the whole capital has become silent. At the city gate, Tang Ning has been waiting for a long time. Since Prince Xian entered the palace, he and Lu Teng and others have retreated outside the city gate. The city is now a powder keg that can be ignited at any time. It is better to stay away from it to avoid being affected. Chen Zhou came over from a distance and said, "Master Tang, someone said that they saw many people in strange clothes going north. They should be the people of the second prince." "Impossible." Wang Yanyan's face turned pale in an instant, and she said, "Second brother and master can't escape, you are lying." "They must have run away." Chen Zhou looked at her and said, "You assassinated Prince Xian, and you will not have a good end if you stay here. What else can you do if you don't run?" Wang Yanyan said stubbornly, "They will come to save me." Chen Zhou said, "They just don't want you." "You are talking nonsense." Wang Yanyan rushed towards Chen Zhou angrily. Tang Ning grabbed her wrist. Who would have thought that Wang Yanyan grabbed his hand and bit it, biting and choking, "It's all your fault. This little girl bit someone." It was not the first time. Tang Ning was about to shake her off, but his expression suddenly froze and looked at the city. A dull bell sounded from a certain direction in the city. Wang Yanyan opened her mouth, wiped her saliva, raised her head, and stared at the city with tears in her eyes. In Kyoto, the common people hid in their homes, listening to the bells, at a loss. The nobles in the capital, who knew the meaning of the bells, were shocked. In the palace, the imperial guards were stunned for a moment, then put down their weapons, turned around and knelt in the direction of a palace. An eunuch walked out of the palace and said in a shrill and thin voice, "Your Majesty has passed away." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 391. The palace does not ring the bell unless it is a major event. Tang Ning did not have a specific count, but estimated that the bell should have rung more than 40 times. The bell rang 95 times, and the emperor passed away. The Chu emperor passed away at this time, and he did not know what the situation was in the palace. He looked at Chen Zhou and said, "Tell Commander Lu to be fully prepared." After he finished speaking, he felt pain on the back of his hand. He looked down and saw that his hand was not only bitten by the little girl, but also had blood oozing out from some places. Tang Ning shook his hand, glanced at her, and said unhappily, "Tie her up." Chen Zhou bowed and said, "Yes, command." He waited outside the city gate for a while, and then a guard came out of the city and posted an imperial edict on the wall. Lu Teng ran to the imperial edict, took a look, and then ran over quickly, shocked, "Lord Tang, the Chu emperor passed away, and in the will, the prince was deposed and the throne was passed to Prince Xian. Although he did not know what happened in the palace just now, the overall situation was settled at this time, and there was nothing to worry about. Lu Teng looked at him and asked, "Sir, we are now." Tang Ning turned his horse and said, "Go and pick up the princess." After struggling for half a year, he tried his best to get the job of escorting the marriage envoy, and rushed all the way. Just after arriving in Chu, he was caught up in the undercurrent. After so much trouble, now the dust has finally settled. The princess of Chen will not marry the deposed prince of Chu. Prince Xian loves his daughter so much that he will definitely not agree to Chen's marriage proposal. His mission in Chu has been successfully completed and he can choose a day to return to Beijing. When Tang Ning led Lu Teng and others to a villa in the far suburbs of Kyoto, the guards at the door were as if they were facing a great enemy. After seeing the person clearly, they hurried in to report. When Tang Ning stepped into the gate of the mansion, a figure rushed over and threw himself into his arms. Tang Ning even staggered and almost fell down because of her collision. Zhao Man's eyes were still sparkling. She looked up at him and choked up, saying, "I was so worried about you." "It's okay, it's okay." Tang Ning patted her back and said, "It's all over." Lu Teng stared at the scene with wide eyes. Chen Zhou stretched out his hand and dragged him out of the door, closing the door by the way. Lu Teng looked back and murmured, "Lord Tang, princess, this." "What's wrong with Lord Tang, what's wrong with the princess?" Chen Zhou looked at him and asked in confusion, "I didn't see anything just now." Lu Teng was stunned for a moment, and after coming to his senses, he looked at the guards in front of him and said, "You just stand outside and wait for Lord Tang and the princess to come out." He rubbed his eyes and said, "I didn't see anything just now." Inside the mansion, Tang Ning gently wiped away Zhao Man's tears, looked up, and saw Li Tianlan standing a few steps in front of him. She looked at Zhao Man, then at Tang Ning, and slowed down her slightly fast steps. Zhao Man looked back, her face flushed, wiped her tears, and let go of Tang Ning. Tang Ning coughed lightly, looked at Li Tianlan, and said, "The king of Chu has passed away, the crown prince has been deposed, and the throne has been passed to Prince Xian. The situation in Kyoto has been settled. I will take you back." Princess Xian came out from the back and said with a complicated expression, Your Majesty has passed away." Tang Ning nodded and said, "The death knell has been sounded in the palace, and the imperial edict has been posted outside." Princess Xian was silent for a moment, sighed, and said, "Let's go." When Tang Ning led them out of the mansion and helped Zhao Man into the carriage, she suddenly looked at the back of Tang Ning's hand and asked anxiously, "What's wrong with your hand? Is it injured?" "It's okay." Tang Ning shook his hand and said, "I was accidentally bitten by a dog." "You are the dog." Wan Yan Yan, who was tied up, glared at him, and seemed to have the urge to pounce on him and bite him again. Zhao Man looked at Wan Yan Yan and asked, "Why is she here again?" Tang Ning explained, "She is our captive now." Zhao Man glared at Wan Yan Yan, stroked the back of his hand, and asked, "Does it still hurt?" "It doesn't hurt anymore." Others were watching from the side. Tang Ning helped her get on the carriage, and said, "It's getting late, let's hurry up." When they left the city just now, the atmosphere in the city was still depressing, but when the group returned, the atmosphere in the capital was already jubilant. The prince has finally been deposed. Your Majesty has passed the throne to His Royal Highness Prince Xian, and the state of Chu is saved. We will have a good life in the future. The death of the emperor is a national tragedy, and it should be a matter of national mourning, but for the people in the capital, the atmosphere of celebration should be higher. Prince Xian did not rebel, and the king of Chu gave up the throne legitimately. This matter should also be a good story in history books. Tang Ning first sent Li Tianlan and the princess back to Prince Xian's mansion. They might not live there for long. After Prince Xian ascended the throne, the princess would become the queen, and the princess would become a princess. The royal family of Chu seemed to have something in common. The king of Chu had only one deceased queen, and Prince Xian had only one princess. It was unknown whether they could give birth to a prince to inherit the throne in the future, but this was not something Tang Ning should consider. The crown prince was deposed, the king of Chu passed away, and his mission on this trip had been completed, so he should also prepare to return. Inside the palace, Prince Xian sat alone on the steps in front of the Yangshen Hall, and the eunuchs and palace maids below were already kneeling. An old eunuch stepped forward and whispered, "Your Majesty, the ministers are waiting in the council hall, waiting for you to take charge of the situation." Prince Xian stood up, waved his hand, and said, "Let the Ministry of Rites do it according to the regulations." The old eunuch said again, "The Grand Master and the Grand Tutor resigned." "That's right. Your Excellency, the two of you are in trouble." "It's all right." King Xian waved his hand again and walked out of the palace. The old eunuch bowed his hands and said, "Yes." The prince was deposed and the emperor died, but it did not cause much commotion in the Chu court. The Ministry of Rites has a complete set of procedures for the etiquette of the death of an emperor. Just follow the steps. His Majesty has been absent from the court for several years, and the court is in good order. It can still operate in an orderly manner without the emperor. The only thing that caused a stir was the resignation of several veteran ministers of the court, the highly respected Taishi and Teifu. In addition, several young ministers in the court also chose to resign, but this was just a matter of calm on the lake. The few pebbles thrown in produced nothing but tiny ripples. In the splendid palace, what happened today has already spread throughout the capital, and the envoys of Chen state have mixed feelings in their hearts. For the marriage, the state of Chen was fully prepared, and the dowry was extremely generous. It sent an envoy to send the princess to marry the state of Chu. But less than a month after they arrived in the capital, the Chu state deposed the prince and overthrew the emperor, catching them by surprise. The prince is not the prince, so their trip was in vain. Fortunately, what happened in Chu state was an accident within an accident and had nothing to do with them. They should not be punished after returning to Beijing. In Tang Ning's room, Zhao Man distressedly applied the medicinal powder to his hand, wrapped it with a white cloth, and then looked at Wang Yanyan, who was tied up in the corner of the room, with a dissatisfied expression on her face. She pointed at Wang Yanyan and asked Tang Ning, "What should we do with her? The second prince and the grassland messenger have both run away, so there is no use in keeping her." Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "Take her back and you will waste food, otherwise you should kill her." "Ah," Zhao Man's face changed, and she said, "It's not good to kill people. How about I bite her for you?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Forget it, we prairie people don't like to take baths, and they all stink." As if she was insulted, Wang Yanyan jumped over and said loudly, "I take a bath every day, and my whole body is fragrant. I don't believe you smell it." Tang Ning reached behind her, untied her rope, and said, "Let's go." Wang Yanyan looked at him and asked in surprise, "Are you going to let me go? The second prince has run away, so there is no use keeping her. She eats so much, and unnecessary food is wasted every day she is kept." As for destroying flowers with ruthless hands, Tang Ning had never thought about it this way. Kittens and puppies would still have feelings after being raised for a long time. He felt very uncomfortable if King Xian really had to deal with the captives he had raised for a month. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "You can leave before I change my mind." Wei Nianyun looked at him and strode outside. When she reached the door, she turned back. Tang Ning looked up at her and asked, "Is there anything else?" She looked at Tang Ning and said confidently, "I don't know the road." "BQ.